Chapter 2, Written in the Rocks. A basic introduction on this first section is the story of life on Earth within the rocks. Many of the greatest fossils are found within deserts or they require quite an adventure. Fossils found are the key in demonstrating on how evolution has occurred, and the fossils let us know what the common ancestors looked like. In order to decipher the history, you need fossils, and then you need to put them in the order from oldest to youngest. The environment that they are actually in may differ, and that changes. Fossil formation has requirements. The first one is the organism needs to find its way into water and go to the bottom of the ocean. Prior to that, it needs to die. It must be covered by sediment so it won't decay. This is why mainly marine organisms are found, because they usually just die and go to the bottom. Bias on fossilized organisms because of the soft parts on plants. It has to survive folding, heating, and crushing of the Earth's crust, and the fossil finally has to be discovered. Over the first 80% of history of life, all species were soft-bodied. That means 250,000 different fossil species have been discovered, and that sounds like a lot, but it's really about 0.1 to 1% of all species. Fossils are found in sedimentary rocks that tend to be slits in the ocean. The deeper the layer, known as the strata, and the older is said to be at the bottom, and the younger layers lie on top. The principle of superstition infers the ages and relation of the rocks, but we don't get actual dates. Radioisotopes are incorporated into igneous rocks when recrystallized. Different isotopes decay at different rates. The older rocks use uranium-238, and the younger rocks use carbon-14, and those vary within half-lives. Through the half-life, you can tell how much was present when formed and how much remains, which gives us accuracy of age. Sedimentary rocks can't be dated, but we can look at the age of fossils by bracketing the sedimentary layers along with the igneous layers. John Wells conducted a way to tell the accuracy of days and hours that existed before, and he did that through the corals. You can actually count the rings on the coral in that. The facts. What constitutes evidence for evolution in the fossil record? First thing is the strata showing simpler organisms, and then they gradually became more complex. Evolutionary change within lineages. That is to say that the species changing over time, but later species should have traits that make them look like their descendants. An example would be the body structure, like mammals evolved from an ancient reptile, so then the fossils of reptiles should become more like mammals. 3 are missing links, and those showed a gap between lineages, but close related eras show the gradual change of evolution. Big patterns. The diagram on the next slide depicts the gradual evolution change from the first organism that arose to a more complex in an ambiguous form. With the simple photosynthetic bacteria's appearance 3.5 billion years ago, that was what dominated land over for 2 million years. Then we have simple eukaryotes arising, and then more complex structured like jellyfish and sponges that arose after. As groups diversify, we see terrestrial plants and tetrapods. Amphibians, reptiles, and the first mammals and birds are seen years after. With these diversifications, we see the land plants and insects diversify even more through the shallowest rocks. Here we see the different eras, the youngest being at the top and the oldest being at the bottom. That's the strata. And that's from the Cambrian era. And we humans are surprisingly considered new since we have been on Earth the least amount of time, but that's 7 million years ago. We have an example of that. If the evolution of the organisms was explained through a year, it would mean that bacteria appeared first in March. That would consider the first living thing. But us, the human ancestors, would only be seen until 6 a.m. on December 31st. The appearance of species seen are not random, but can be seen as a gradual change, as we have transitional fossils to connect the groups. Fossilized evolution and speciation. Having a good layer of sediment shows a good transition between layers. Plankton is something that's ideal for that. The figure shows evolutionary change in the marine foraminiferan over an 8 million year period. Here it tells you to look at the whorls, and you see the number of changes, and that is determined on the side. In the following figure on the next slide, it shows the evolution as a gradual change, but not necessarily a smooth one. The organisms in the diagram were taking over for an 18-meter long core. Many changes that occur not as smoothly are due to the environment and occur spontaneously. So we do see a gradual change here, but it's not a smooth transition within. And here we have the trilobites. So they have the different lineages that were found. And then we have the fossils of the trilobites that were similar. Some of the trilobites went in opposite directions during the same period. Overall, evolution seems to be gradual and changes within pace and direction. However, that being said, this does not mean that all species do undergo evolution and change. It just states the gradual changes when it does occur and the splitting that can happen between lineages.
The missing link. One of the things that the fossil record can show is transitional forms. Transitional forms are fossils that show microevolution, little changes in shape and size of traits over time of different living organisms. Once enough time has passed, specialization can occur and can be shown through the fossil record. For many microevolutions, a macroevolution can occur, and this is the cause of one kind of living organism to start looking like another different organism or different lineage. For every two species that are similarly close yet have different traits, have an intermediate species that can connect to two. They can be called the missing link. Obtaining the missing link between two species can be nearly impossible because the fossil record is too incomplete. Finding the exact species that lie between two other species may prove difficult, but there are many different cousins and relatives to study from, and this is what the biologists did in the age of Darwin. They studied the hearts and skulls of birds that were close to relatives of reptiles, and the way that biologists knew that reptiles came before birds was because in the fossil record reptiles appeared before the birds. Finding the missing link would be an amazing discovery of common ancestry between species, but it doesn't require the missing link to do this, because we can also study from the different relatives. With other related species and similar traits, they can lead it back to older kinds of organisms. In 2004, a transitional form was discovered between a fish and an amphibian. This discovery was able to tell biologists many things about how vertebrates made the transition from sea to land. 390 million years ago, the only vertebrates were found in water, but 30 million years later, terrestrial vertebrates were found. The first terrestrial vertebrates were similar to the modern-day amphibian in such ways, where they have necks, developed legs, and limb girdles. Along with these traits, the first terrestrial vertebrate were similar to low-fin fishes with back tails that can propel themselves in water. The transitional form of early tetrapods was discovered, and the name was Tiktaalik rosei. The person that discovered Tiktaalik was Neil Schubrin, who had studied limbs from fins and was searching to understand the stages of evolution of limbs from fins. He came up with the prediction that if there were no terrestrial vertebrae 390 million years ago and 360 million years ago had terrestrial vertebrae, he should search the strata from 375 million years ago in an area of fresh water. Schubert predicted that they would find what they were looking for in the Arctic, and after many years of not finding anything there, they were about to give up because they were running low on funds. But at the final expedition, he had finally found what they were looking for, Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik featured many early low fin traits, such as scales, gills, and fins, as well as later amphibian traits such as the flat head, nostrils, and eyes at the top as opposed to the eyes on the sides. Tiktaalik had a neck, but low fin fish didn't have a neck, and because their head was connected to their shoulders. And another feature that it had was that it had ribs that could help it move oxygen into its lungs from its gills. It also adapted to living and crawling in shallow waters. This picture right here is what they would have predicted how Tiktaalik looked from looking at its fossils. The transition from land animals to animals with the ability to fly was through natural selection. The first step of evolution of flight was to have the ability to glide. After that, they would later have the ability to flap and travel longer distance to stay airborne longer as well. Fossils showing how flying birds evolve have been discovered. The theropods, two-legged carnivorous dinosaurs that were the common ancestors of birds. From 200 million years ago, there were theropods that were found on the fossil record, and from 70 million years ago, there were fossils of birds that were similar to modern-day birds. One of the examples of bird-like reptiles was the Archaeopteryx. Another one of those examples is the Sinornithosaurus millenni, whose body had long little feathers, but it couldn't fly. The next example is the Microraptor gui. Its feature consists of fully feathered arms and legs, and this evolutionary step was probably able to glide as well. Another example would be the Melon, and it was a slightly larger organism than the Archaeopteryx, and it had bird-like behaviors because this is known because it was found in sleeping position of birds. The one on the top left is the Archaeopteryx, and the one on the top right is the Sinornithosaurus millenni. The one on the bottom left is the Microraptor gui, and the one on the bottom right is the Melon. These are the fossils that biologists have studied to look at the evolution of modern-day birds.
Since the 17th century, it has been known that whales and their relatives are mammals. They are warm-blooded and produce live young, whom they feed with milk. DNA evidence and vestigial traits, like the hind legs and rudimentary pelvis, show that their ancestors lived on land. Whales most certainly evolved from a species known as artiodactyls, mammals that have an even number of toes, and the closest living relative is the hippo. The hippo, who is mostly aquatic, comes out to graze only at night. Whales have unique features of their own that they developed, such as the absence of rear legs, a flat fluke-like tail, paddle-shaped front limbs, a nostril on top of their head known as a blowhole, a short neck, simple conical teeth, and special features in their ears that allow them to hear underwater, and lastly, their projective vertebrae to help support the strong swimming muscles. The traits are easily traced through fossils that have been found in the Middle East. These fossils give proof that the whale came from terrestrial forms of life. 60 million years ago, there was a lot of fossilized mammals, but no whales. Animals that resembled modern whales showed up 30 million years ago. So to find the transitional forms, we find them in the gap between these time periods. Recently, a discovery of an animal called Indohyus came to surface as the beginnings of what became of the modern whale. It was a raccoon-sized creature that lived about 48 million years ago, and as predicted, it was an artiodactyl. We know they are related to whales because of the special features of the teeth and the ears that we can only find in the modern whales today. It is a partially aquatic animal as proof of the denser bones than those of the fully terrestrial animals. Indohyus probably was what began the road for the whale's ancestors to becoming fully aquatic. After Indohyus, we find many more fossils that begin the tree to the modern whale we know today. 52 million years ago, we find a wolf-sized skull of an animal known as Pachycetus. More aquatic than Indohyus, it had simpler teeth and whale-like ears as well. Then 2 million years later, we find Ambulocetus, which also means walking whale. This creature was bigger with an elongated skull and robust limbs. It probably spent most of its time in shallow waters, but could have waded around on land like a seal. 3 million years after Ambulocetus, we find Rhodocetus, which is even more aquatic, and nostrils moved more further back and a much more elongated skull. Finally, 40 million years ago, we find Baleosaurus and Dorodon, fully aquatic animals which could not have spent any time on land. Fossils are the main proof that evolution does actually take place. We know them from fossils of transitional animals, animals such as the predicted ant wasp Secomyrma frey, snakes evolving from lizard-like reptiles who lost their legs, and birds coming after dinosaurs. But the most amazing of all is Haecuella lanceolata, which was an eel-like creature which is thought to be the earliest chordate which gave rise to all chordates, humans included. Fossils occur in an order that makes evolutionary sense, such as the landforms of whales that eventually became aquatic. Evolution nearly always acts on remodeling old traits of already existing traits. For example, legs of land animals modified from fish limbs, wings of birds from legs of dinosaurs. Evolution cannot make new traits out of thin air. New species are modified versions of older ones, in which fossils are the ultimate proof that evolution has existed since the beginning of time and is an ongoing process.